Welcome to the Global Journalism Seminars. This is The Briefing. Me Too was first conceptualized by Tarana Burke in 2006 and gained global attention in October 2017 as a social media campaign against sexual harassment and assault, especially in the workplace. Over the past 7 years, Me Too has brought significant societal and legal reforms in many countries, including in the ways the news media investigate and report stories of sexual harassment and violence. We asked 15 journalists, what is the most important lesson reporters should have learned from Me Too? 60% said ensuring due diligence in reporting, 13% each said prioritizing survivors' voices and experiences, promoting inclusivity to prevent unconscious bias, and advocating for more ethical reporting and less sensationalism. Our guest today is Rosamund Urwin, media editor at the Sunday Times. Rosamund is known for her insightful commentary, in-depth reporting, and analysis on a broad spectrum of topics, from corporate scandals to societal issues, including gender equality. She recently worked on a joint investigation by the Sunday Times and Channel 4 News into allegations against a popular British comedian. Their reporting resulted in an ongoing police investigation and civil litigation. To safeguard both processes, we will not discuss that case today. Instead, we will discuss how Me Too has changed the way the media covers such stories, lessons learned, and what remains to be improved. That's The Briefing. Let's begin. Hello and welcome to the Global Journalism Seminars. And Rosamund, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Lovely to be here.
Such a pleasure to have you, and especially the fact that you made time for us while you're on maternity leave. I'm really, really grateful that you squeezed us in amongst all of the additional duties that you're having to fulfill at the moment. I wonder if we could start with a little trip down memory lane. 2016 feels like a lifetime ago. Do you remember where you were when you first became aware of the Me Too movement? And how did you report on it at the time?
Yeah, and actually it changed the kind of journalism I do, slightly indirectly at first. So back then I was mostly a columnist and feature writer. I had been a news journalist, but I'd moved mostly away from that. So I did columns and interviews really. And when the Me Too movement broke, so October 2017, I think in most people's mind, obviously there was a pre-existing movement, and actually I think there's a wider point about diversity and different voices there, which we might get. But when the Harvey Weinstein story broke, so brilliant reporting by the New York Times, utterly inspiring. Obviously, the New Yorker was working on the same story at the same time, but incredible reporting. Two brilliant women at the helm of that, which I think is actually really important, because I think investigative journalism can often, I don't know more broadly, but in the UK certainly, it's often dominated by men. So brilliant reporting, really brave of the paper in lots of ways, and a figure who it was kind of an open secret about, right? I mean, not in the broader world, but in Hollywood, where he was really well known, it was known, at least people would have had rumors and all that. And obviously sometimes journalism is about reporting the things that everybody knows, but nobody's totally together. And so at that point, yes, I was a columnist and reporter. And there were some lesser stories in the UK that broke, obviously nothing at that stage on that scale. And I remember there was a story, and I'm not going to name him because this has never gone to court or anything. There was a story about a journalist who had been inappropriate with a huge number of young female journalists. And this is what sort of changed the kind of journalism I do, because I read two columnists' views on it, and they had the same view, basically, which was, well, it's one woman's word against this man, isn't it terrible that we're now sort of stringing him up and da da da. And I thought if they had picked up the phone, and this is a problem with columnists, I don't mean everywhere, but in the UK, this is certainly a problem with columnists. If they had picked up the phone and rang any young female journalist they know, they would have known he was the kind of person that everyone said he's not safe in taxis, that sort of idea. But they didn't ring anyone. And so all of us were having these conversations, usually on WhatsApp, saying, oh my God, thank God this has finally come out. I didn't know the extent of his behavior, but, we all thought he was, a wrong one, let's just put it that way. And essentially, and then here I am reading in the paper these two accounts that just say, well, he's got, we don't know what happened, no one else was there. It's like, well, I genuinely know 40 women who've got stories about this guy. So if you just ask someone, and that made me very disillusioned with comment journalism. And it sort of was what led me back to reporting. I mean, I took a bit of a windy path there, but eventually it took me back to this. I did write, I later went on to write about some of the women who made a civil claim against Weinstein in the UK, probably about 2020, I think that was. And so, but obviously you're covering a story that some other people have obviously done all the hard work on. So that's a bit different. But and I found when I moved back to reporting, I found that this was an area where I really felt that it lent itself to the skills I have. I don't think every bit of investigative journalism would be for me, but for whatever reasons, I thought that this is work that I was actually quite naturally, well, I hope naturally good at. I think I made loads of mistakes along the way too. I think this lends itself to the skills I have.
Yeah. So when we're talking about these stories, since Me Too, we've talked a lot more about taking a victim-centered approach. What does that mean to you in terms of journalism?
But I think it's often incredibly difficult because when you're making approaches to these people, when you think they might be a victim, even that first approach has got to be very, very careful. I eventually, over the years, have come up with a way to do it, which never involves, if I think the person could be a victim, even if I don't know if they are, you can't mention the person's name, for example, because obviously that can be what we'd call triggering. That can be very upsetting for somebody even to see that name. And you don't know the state of somebody's mental health. For a lot of these people, you're asking them about the worst thing that's ever happened to them. Some of them are waiting for someone to get in touch with them. Particularly after Me Too, one of the things that October 2017 did, when the Weinstein story breaks, there are a whole bunch of people who thought, well, is he, i.e. the one who's done something terrible to them, or she, occasionally, but is he going to be the next person? And so obviously there's some people who are waiting for a journalist to get in touch with them, but they're really in a minority, I think. I think most people, when they see your email, they think, oh, go away, you horrible journalist, basically. And so that's a very difficult thing to manage. And sometimes, obviously, it takes a long, long time to build relationships. And the classic thing is someone will talk to you and go quiet. And you don't know if the right thing to do is push very gently. This is something I grapple with, and I think it's different in different cases. But the real challenge is knowing when you've got to leave somebody alone, or the right thing to do is to get gently back in touch and say, look, this is actually moving along now. But I think people don't, maybe I think people understand this a bit better now, but a lot of people don't understand this, that sometimes these stories can take years. I've done ones that I managed to do in a week, but they're rare, and they're usually things where people have done something in an institution, so usually a business. So when I've done corporate ones, you have access to all the people who ever worked there, and you pick the ones, you can be quite targeted and clever about approaching people. But when it's somebody, I can name him, by the way, I can say his name. When it's somebody like Russell Brand, who's been in lots of different spaces, so comedy, addiction, yoga in LA, Hollywood a bit, you've got lots of different areas, a huge number of sources potentially to talk to. It's like, where do you start? So that's a different kind of challenge from, say, a smaller one about, say, a company boss who people making complaints about.
Yeah, I love that you mentioned the term open secrets around Weinstein, because one of my favorite reviews of your reporting was from Jane Bradley saying, the hardest stories to report on are the open secrets. Do you have any kind of key lessons to share on how you do you agree with her, and do you have any lessons to share around how to tackle those?
Yes, that's such a really astute. I mean, obviously, Jane's a brilliant journalist. This is a very astute point. So when there have been a couple of stories, so not to make it too specific, a couple of stories where when you ring someone up, they say, "Oh, but of course," and you say, "But hang on a minute, no one's ever published anything about this. No one's ever, nobody's actually done this." And when they have attempted it, they've obviously shied away from it. So, there were things written in the past about this person, and they never got there. So I think it's really challenging. I would say the other problem with open secret stories is very often other outlets have tried to do them. And so you'll ring somebody up and they'll say, "Well, I spoke to the Mail on Sunday, say, in 2014, and it didn't go anywhere." And you say, "Okay, well, I'm really sorry about that." But I'm obviously that's a specific example. But there are a couple of people or big number of people originally who said, "Well, I spoke to X, Y, and Z publication and it just got dropped." And convincing people that this might be the time when you don't know that. That's the other challenge. You think, I could, well, I'm not better than any of these other people. I might just get a bit luckier potentially. But you think no one else managed it. And, when you've got a story, I think one of the other major challenges there is convincing editors, because they say, "Well, my colleague at whichever publication I used to work at tried to do that story, and, brackets, they're really good. And so if they didn't manage it, why are you going to be the person who does?" And, obviously, I worked in this for 4 years, on and off, though. I should say I've had 2 babies in that time. So that's 2 years of that were taken up with mat leave. And then by the end, a huge number of other people were working on it too, particularly my colleague at the time, Charlotte Wace, who was amazing, but and did a lot of the reporting when I was on leave. She was on it full time as well, so that's a bit different. But you think on your own, when it is you at the beginning and you're not working on it with someone else, you think, how do I know I'm going to be any different? And maybe I get everybody's hopes up and it doesn't end up going anywhere again. And that can actually be incredibly upsetting for victims. I think you've just got to be incredibly persistent and dogged. I mean, I was saying, so this is out in the world, so I can say this. I had a little file on my desk, and this did come out as a story. So the former Deputy Prime Minister, Dominic Raab, was accused of bullying allegations. And I was seeing all the stories that I haven't managed to get over the line. And I had this wafer thin file on my desk, whereas Mr. Brand's file was always a thick, heavy one. But it had basically about 4 pages in it, and we couldn't get it off the ground. And eventually it came out through political journalism, which I think sometimes these stories might be it might be a slightly easier way for some of those stories to come out. Still very, very difficult. But if somebody, political sources, they might know the civil servants in a way that, and they might more like to speak to political journalists than say somebody who's an investigative journalist or working in a different sphere. But yes, it's very challenging, and also keeping interest of news desks over years and different editors and so on. Challenging.
It sounds like a trust game on both sides of the spectrum that you have to deal with the victims and with the editors, just consistently building trust over however long it takes.
Yeah, and I think also you have to pick what you're going to focus on. So I had a day job. I mean, I was doing this around the edges, basically. And one of the difficult challenges there is, people have got in touch with me, obviously, to say, "Well, you should look at this person next," or whatever. And I think, well, one, I mean, have I got 4 years to spend on somebody else? Yes, I mean, I do. But I've got to pick, I've got to make a very careful decision. And it can be very hard, when you're doing the sort of day job, not to get engulfed in other stories and therefore distracted from your longer term investigation. Not everything would take that long, though, I should say. But and towards the end, particularly, so obviously we were working with TV for this, so there was a lot of meetings, and that takes up a huge amount of time when you're not actually doing the reporting. So that's also a challenge, that towards the end of an investigation, if it's a joint investigation as ours was, you're having a lot of meetings about sort of logistical stuff that isn't actually relevant. And at the same time, the major challenge, you talked about building up trust with the women, and obviously one of the biggest challenges is you take a huge amount of time with a victim, which obviously is very, very important, and they need to know you're there for them. but you're not trained in any way on that. I'm not a counselor. You can offer them what you're offering them is quite a specific thing. And I think it can be very hard. I mean, I say that because I'm not professionally trained in that regard, and I don't want to be giving somebody advice when I know that it's the right thing for them, So you have to kind of be aware of your limitations.
Yeah.
Because, I'm not a trained counselor.
Yeah.
So while I want to help these women get their stories into the world, or on Me Too stories, or men sometimes, but generally women, I think the challenge is that at the same time, what I'm offering them is a limited thing. I'm not offering them, and I don't know how they'll feel at the end of it. People tend to be glad that they've done it. My experience, I haven't had anyone yet in my reporting say, I'm really upset that I spoke out. That can change, and that could be different someday.
I've got two follow-up questions from that, and the first is that I genuinely cringe when I think about some of the interviews I've done in the past, kind of not knowing about trauma-informed victim interviewing, and some of how ill-equipped I was. What do you wish you had known sooner about how to interview victims?
I think I've made loads of mistakes, and I think we should always be quick with an apology when we get things wrong. I think that's really important.
Yeah.
People aren't, I mean, everyone I've ever dealt with, they're not expecting you to be perfect on these. They're not expecting you to say the perfect thing. Obviously, they want you to be empathetic and kind. Of course they do. And that should be a bare minimum. But they don't expect you to be superhuman at the same time. And I have sometimes said the wrong thing. And I've always, I hope when I've realized I've done it, I've apologized immediately. I think just making sure that I mean, it's the classic, isn't it? I imagine what I would feel like in that situation if a journalist approached me, and I accept that people have different reactions and so on. So you want to think about the sort of breadth of how a victim or survivor might respond to things. But at the same time, one thing that's really stayed with me is I was talking to one of the women, and I'm not allowed to advise on whether someone goes to the police, but she was considering it. I had to be incredibly careful. That's something I had to be incredibly careful that I wasn't giving advice. So, but you've built up a relationship and people want to talk to you about what's going on in their lives. And also, if they've told very few people, you may be one of very few people who knows this. So, my as I say to her, she can call me any time of day. But she was talking about this, and she said, the thing with you is you always believed me. And I did, but at the same time, I'm still a journalist. That doesn't mean I've still got to do all of the rigorous journalistic stuff. And I think that's a real challenge. I did believe her. We get a view of the kind of person, that is part of why I tend to think I'm quite good at this, is I think I'm quite good at knowing whether someone's telling the truth or not. I'm fundamentally. And there were lots, but I still had to be incredibly journalistically rigorous. And that can sound really harsh. And I was glad she said that, because I thought, by the end, she's probably thinking, well, you don't believe me because you've asked me to deliver this, this, and this, and this piece of evidence, talk to this person. And that is asking a lot of a person. It's a very intrusive process. But I think what I've learned is the more time you spend on it, and it is just time, isn't it? You give the person, if they want it. Some people don't want that. Some people want a much more detached relationship. But if they want that time, you sort of just got to give it. But yes, I mean, I listened back to the first interview I did with one of the women on the brand story. I didn't get everything right by any stretch, but yeah, and she stuck with me. And also, I think my big thing is I never worked out, and I'm still working this one through. When someone goes quiet, what is the appropriate amount to communicate with them? I still don't really know the answer to that, and I'm learning that one, because I think I sometimes let people go a little bit too much because I was so fearful of being accused of basically harassing them.
Yeah.
So that is a challenge.
I just want to clarify there. I could just hear a legal department screaming down the corridor. When you say I didn't get everything right there, you meant I didn't get everything right with the interview process
Oh,
of
yes.
the victim.
Yes. Yeah. No. I'm incredibly happy with our reporting.
Yeah.
I would say, I mean, look, our lawyers were very, very, very stringent, as rightly they should be. I mean, they were absolutely, these stories don't get out there without brilliant lawyers, actually.
Mm.
And one thing that's always overlooked. No, look, what I mean is, if I could go back to,
Yeah.
I also would have, there's people I didn't approach because I thought they were too close to things.
Mm.
This is the advantage of having other people on board. Those approaches were made. I could have made some of those approaches a lot earlier, but you're juggling something right at the beginning when you don't know if it's going to go anywhere. What you don't want to be in is a situation where it doesn't go anywhere and the person gets tipped off. And there was a fear you could. I'm not talking about this particular scenario, but in theory, if you go too close to a person too soon, they get tipped off and they go legal on some of the other sources you have.
Yeah.
They tried to shut the story down. So I think I could have done that a lot faster. Would have done now. There's people I didn't approach because I thought they were too close to someone close to a alleged perpetrator. No, but I mean, look, we are very happy with our investigation, and there's nothing there yet. That's worrying me in any way.
Is there something to be said around setting expectations and managing expectations with the people that the victims that you interview around A, your qualifications as a counselor, B, the fact that your relationship isn't going to continue on very far beyond publishing, these sort of the expectation of public backlash and preparing them for what may happen.
Yeah, and there's a question, isn't there, around people being named and not named. And one of the changes in our society that's made it harder for women to get named is the cesspit that is the online world. And I mean, particularly, obviously, the site formerly known as Twitter. It's so nasty now, and it's so, so yes, you have to prepare them for that. One thing I always say is that's not the real world. Twitter, particularly now, because it's just full of bots, really. If you look at it on a Me Too story, often it's, they haven't engaged with the actual journalism. They haven't looked at the evidence that's been provided. They say a huge bunch of things that aren't true. There is no evidence, and all those kinds of things that just aren't true. And they haven't actually even read the story, and then sometimes they're just bots. There's 1,000 people basically saying the same thing, and they've all got Twitter names that sort of at them with loads of numbers on them. So that's part of it. So yes, I think you need to prepare people for online backlash, particularly if it's a celebrity with a big online following. Particularly now, if it's a big sort of online anti-mainstream media type following. So that's something specific. I don't take the same approach of not having any relation. I mean, when this investigation came out, I actually got in touch with a couple of people on previous investigations I'd worked on to see how they were doing. So I think there is a duty of care that extends beyond publication. It's not for everybody, and if a journalist isn't going to do that, I think they need to be upfront about it. But fundamentally, I'm legally entwined with these people for at least a bit longer in terms of possible theoretical legal action. So I don't think so. On a professional level, I don't think I could just say, hey, I'm never going to talk to you ever again. On a personal level, I wouldn't want to. You do get to know somebody in a very odd way, and I'm in awe. I mean, I worked very closely with the woman that we called Alice on the Brown investigation. I'm completely in awe of her. What she did was incredibly brave and difficult, and she was there before anyone else, really, saying this all. And she actually is the one who approached the agents to say, this is a man you're working for, allegedly, I have to say. But with her allegations, she had tried to speak out previously with her allegations, and obviously hadn't felt listened to. So she had done things before. It wasn't as though she called up a journalist straight away. And so I don't want to, I don't see that I stop being a human just because I'm also a journalist.
Yeah.
And I do continue to care for these people in some,
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's kind of a weird contradiction between how you building trust and setting expectations. That doesn't sound like the same thing, really, saying like, look, I don't know how far this will go. I don't know what will happen after it gets published. And I don't know that I can guarantee it will get published, but please trust me.
Yeah.
It does it's hard
Mm.
to actually set expectations without losing
Yeah.
the story.
Yeah, I think so. I think that difficulty of this may never ever make it into print,
Mm.
is a really, really difficult one. But I think you do have to be honest about that. These stories are the most difficult ones I work on, certainly. I mean, there's other things that are difficult, but this is difficult in quite a specific way, I suppose. Yeah.
I'm going to ask you two more questions and then go to the questions coming in from the room. And if you're online, please feel free to add questions using the Q&A feature. But when we were talking about the trolls, there is a very particular type of trolling that happens around these stories that it's almost rabid. And one of the things we most frequently hear, why didn't she go to the police? Why did she go to the media? Do you want to address that?
Yeah, I do. So, yes, I got this a huge amount. And I've had some other stories before, but this was the kind of story where an awful lot. And I find it really interesting in a way because you actually don't get that with other crime stories. So if a journalist looks into an unsolved murder from a long time ago, okay, I get that's different because the police have had a go, maybe potentially. No one's saying we should have gone to the police rather than the interesting thing is people don't just say this to the victims, they also say it to us as journalists. So they say instead of doing all this work on story and then publishing it, you should have just taken all your evidence to the police. Which anyway, so it's but also say a fraud thing that originally comes out in the media, say nobody's saying, well, hang on, it's terrible. The person who had some information on this should have just gone to the police firsthand. But no, they've leaked it to the media or given it to the media or whatever. So I think that's interesting. And I think so one thing that makes it quite different from a fraud story, right, is that the victims, the sources and the victims are often the same. The main sources on Me Too stories, obviously, victims or survivors. And so that's different from, so you can sort of see who the source of information is inevitably much more clearly than say on a story about a mass fraud somewhere where, it's not obvious who's leaked the information or given the information, but, it's women are having their voice and speaking out, and therefore it's obvious, isn't it, that they're the source of that information. So there is a reason for it a tiny bit, but I don't think people understand. In the UK, police don't proactively look into someone. Someone has to have made a complaint, at which point, and we're in a really interesting time in reporting, which I personally don't agree with. So where the police won't even, so say we go to the police and say, we understand you're looking into this individual in relation to sexual offences, and they don't name the person. When the police put something out, they say a man in his 40s has been interviewed under caution. They don't actually name him because they're responding to our request naming the individual. We know it is that person, obviously, but it's not as though the police are sort of shouting from the rooftops who they're investigating, because obviously, I won't go into all of the reasons for this in the UK, because they're to do with journalism basically done badly, not anything to do with me, but I should add, or anybody at Sunday Times, unfortunately, mostly actually the BBC, weirdly. But, there've been a couple of catastrophic stories which have changed the way the police behave.
Right,
and so
right,
you're not even naming the person. So the problem is if a woman goes to the police aren't going to tell anyone, there's no other way for more women to come forward, right? Because they don't know, oh, someone else has gone to the police, I'm not alone. In most Me Too stories, sometimes the victims know each other, and I think that is a slightly different case. But where the victims don't know each other and we're the people proactively trying to find them, the police wouldn't do that. So it is, some of these things do need to come out journalistically. And I don't really know why people think they have a right to tell people who've had something happen to them, or that they allege have had something happen to them. I don't know why people think they have a right to tell them what the right thing to do is, because it's like the right thing for one woman could be to go to the police, but for a lot of people it isn't. And also in the UK, there are particular problems with the Met Police. I mean, there have been a series of horrific stories. The most extreme, a police officer murdered raped and murdered a woman that he used his badge to say she was to her that she was the police, that he was the police. So there's a lot of and obviously these are broader issues in other countries too, where the police are not necessarily the place that is trusted, but lots of people don't want to go to the police, and I sort of think that's fine, right? That's their choice. If this is the way that they want this story to come out, and one of the things about why we didn't go to the police with the evidence is I had no right to. It's not my evidence. It belongs to other people. They've shared it with. But it wasn't as though, I mean, if they told me they wanted me to go to the police with it, that would be different. But they hadn't said that. So, I believe that one really, really firmly, because the only way some of these stories are going to come out is through investigative journalism.
Yeah.
And I think that's something we should be mindful of as an industry, but also really proud that that's something helpful that we could potentially do, and good that we can do. But yeah, it is the constant, why didn't they go to the police? Yeah, the whole time.
I mean,
I see that about
it's the whole beauty of the Me Too movement was it allowed women to go Me Too, but I would say 95% of those women never went to the police because
you get on trial yourself, don't you? You do.
Let me switch gears to
feel like you can.
oh, sorry, Rosamund. It's breaking up a little bit there. I'm just gonna let the connection catch up. There you go, you're back. I want to ask one last question, and then there are some really good questions coming in online and downstairs. We'll go to Charlie next. But should you, in your personal opinion, should somebody who has an unresolved trauma around a Me Too do reporting on this kind of story?
This is a really good question. And, a lot of the good reporting on this, not exclusively, but does tend to be done by women. And, obviously some of them, unfortunately, will be, and obviously some men do, but we're mostly talking about women here. Some of them will be the victims of sexual trauma themselves. And I think that can bring a level of empathy and understanding. But you've got to have got to a point with it where, I found this deeply upsetting investigation. I found all the Me Too stories I've done deeply upsetting to work on, but I can handle it. I'm very lucky in the things that have happened to me. I'm not carrying around a huge trauma that hasn't in some way been resolved. So I can't imagine if I had got something that I hadn't sort of talked through and been fine with, I can't imagine it would be a healthy thing mentally to do that. But I do think there are some people for whom it actually might be something that drives to, they understand. I would find it quite hard not to, it's all these things. We've got to not take our own biases to things. And, ultimately, one of the things that would be really challenging in my mind is you're interrogating somebody who's a victim of sexual assault, i.e. you're asking them to provide the evidence they have and so on. And I think that would be a horrible, I mean, to me, that's horrible enough. And I don't have any of these traumas that I'm bringing to the table. I also wonder if you haven't sort of confronted that, if you wouldn't accidentally sometimes be sort of, when you're talking about it with the person, you're actually talking about what's happened to you. And I think that's very, very difficult. But look, I don't want to tell anyone they can't do any form of reporting. I think you know, if you're a survivor of something and it drives you into helping other survivors talk through their stories, and you're still doing all the rigorous stuff journalistically, which you would be doing if you're a good journalist, then I think you should sort of feel able to do whatever reporting you want to do on this. So I don't have a simple answer there. I think it's very complicated and difficult, though.
Yeah, yeah. Let's go to Charlie downstairs, also from the UK, and then I'll get more global as the time goes by. This is not the UK journalism seminars, but go on, Charlie, hit it. Great questions.
Hi, Rosamund. Nice to see you. Thank you so much for a great interview. I guess I had a few questions, but the main one is just I'd love to hear a bit more about how you verify allegations against individuals. You touched on it a wee bit, but I guess I'm curious to know whether or not how you do that has shifted over the years. Have you found different organizations, such as like the TV companies you've worked with and that sort of thing, require different levels of proof based on different legal advice? Yeah, I'd love to hear a bit more about that. Thank you.
Okay. So most companies have an incredibly high standard of proof. So I don't suppose we get much difference between organizations, really. What I would say is we're talking about things that have happened usually, and other people aren't present. Not always. I did a story about companies. So it is sometimes possible that there are witnesses, and obviously if there are witnesses, that does make things easier, but it is incredibly difficult to verify these stories. Now, in the case of the Russell Brand story, I can say this, but there was somebody with a very high level of evidence, the woman who's known as Nadia, who is the one who worked very closely with my colleague Charlotte Wace at the Times. And, you know, you normally don't have that level of evidence. So she'd gone to a rape crisis centre. There were text messages that hinted at things. So there was a lot of evidence there. You're normally not going to have that. What you can find, if the women don't know each other and you can prove they don't know each other, you can have corroborating accounts. So that was something that was, you know, on many stories you find that people are saying very similar things. So people who have patterns of behaviour. One thing that really worries me, though, is, you know, we're always asking, you know, how women have come forward, so he's done it to one person, right? And so there is no one else to come forward and there's no one else to find. Are we saying that that somehow has less value? And I think it means it's almost unreportable. There is maybe the odd occasion where you can get one person, they're willing to be named, they've got a huge amount of evidence, contemporaneous evidence, and so on. So a lot of but generally speaking, those stories would be unreportable. So I think that's really, really unfair, and I don't have a solution to that. So it's a numbers thing, I think, partly. So if you can get, you know, 5 people, 4 people, whatever it is, you're starting to build a case, aren't you? And then obviously talking to people who were around at the time, so family members, colleagues they might have told, you know, friends they told at the time. That can be a lot of you can get a lot of corroborating evidence at the time, but you will find that there's the odd contradictory thing occasionally. I mean, you know, a lot of time has often passed. If we're talking about historic sexual offences, you know, my memory of something, I mean, I think this, okay, so actually a good example to come off the Me Too thing, I covered a terror offence once, a terror attack, and people who were standing sort of 100 metres from each other had completely different accounts of exactly what happened. And people's memories do funny things. And we've got the passage of time here. I think it's a slightly different thing. But, you know, can you remember your friend telling you exactly that, you know, what did they tell you in this time? Well, obviously it would still be a horrific thing and you probably would remember your friend telling you something like this, but you might not remember the details in the way that they do. And you've got to kind of, you know, ultimately you are resting on people's testimony. The other thing obviously is you've got to ask the people who've got the strongest claim. I mean, this is specific to UK libel law, but in the UK, if you were sued and you had to go for a truth defence, you you've got to ask them, are they willing to get on the stand for you, which is a big ask. Obviously, if they're not, the journalist can defend their own, but it's stronger, obviously, to have the person whose allegation it is. And assuming they are willing to do that, you know, which is a very big ask, you know, that obviously would actually give you some comfort if they were willing to get up in court having, you know, signs saying they were, or stated that they were telling the truth. That would give you a lot of comfort in what they were saying. But I think also, oh, look, I'll be really honest about this. A lot of people get in touch with you. You know, these are people we found. When people get in touch with you, so sometimes it's because they know they got a good story. Sometimes it's because there's somebody who's exhausted all the other possibilities. And I mean, more broadly, sometimes it's because what they're saying isn't true. So, you know, you've always got to have that in your mind, and that's a really cool thing. You do some work on it, you work that out for yourself, and you have to have a really awkward conversation about why you're not taking it forward. And that's really challenging. But the verification is very, very difficult. And sometimes somebody will come to you and say, I've never actually told anyone else this. And so you think, well, I'm amazed you're telling me, and that's really brave. But that's really tricky. You have no evidence, and you know, like, and you've got to piece together. Often people say that, and actually they have done things. They have told somebody, or somebody knows half the story. Somebody was there for part of it, and so there is stuff you can still do to provide evidence for what they're saying. But yeah, it's challenging.
Mm. I've got a question from Christina in Portugal, who says she's been trolled really badly when she wanted to communicate something that had happened to her and another woman from the UK. What can we do? The authorities never took them seriously, and the whole investigation is here in the UK. Do you have any advice on what to do when you're being trolled? For Christina?
Yeah, it's a horrific thing to go to.
Mm-hmm.
Most journalists, you know, more have had, well, most female, most people, yeah, will have had horrific things come into their inbox, racist, sexist, you know, death threats, rape threats. You know, it's a horrific world online, I think. I mean, it can also do great things. I don't want to be totally negative about it, but you know, why are we allowing, I don't know, anyway, but I think we could, you know, there's a lot to do around safety online in terms of people who've either reported crimes or, you know, to protect them. I think there's a lot more that could be done there. But parking that aside, as an individual, it should fall on the individual, but if we're thinking about it as an individual, you know, my husband's had to take my phone off various points and just look after it for a bit. I don't think that, I mean, I realize that's not a great solution, but if a friend or something
that is a
go
great
through
solution.
it.
Yeah.
So it's not you, but then, I mean, I do think that's upsetting for the other person too. But
Yeah.
I mean, you just prep them today. The other thing I realized, and look, I don't want to minimize anything. I had just massively overshare for a second. I had a stalker who started off online who actually came to my offices, and it was a horrific thing to experience. So I don't want to say that never happens, but my husband was very good about managing my expectations in advance of publication of the Russell Brand investigation, because I said to him, you know, I'm concerns. And he said, but these people are online. And I don't mean this doesn't mean that everybody always stays online, but most of the people vile things into the world online, they wouldn't actually say it to your face. And I did find it helpful. So I do find it sometimes helpful. That helps me. I don't know if that would help anyone else, but I think I just remember that this doesn't mean that they'd say it to my face if they saw me. And sometimes I think, you know, if it's vile and it's attached to somebody who's telling you where they work, call up their boss. Tell their mum, you know, there's some great comedian, I think it was, who was online, like finding the mums of all of the people who trolled her, saying horrific things and saying, do you realize what your 15-year-old son is saying about me online? And, you know, mums are not going to put up with that. But look, that is a particularly niche form of dealing with these things. But I think some people have great ideas around this of how to, I think, remind sometimes when they are people, to remind them that person. I rang up someone's boss once and I said, do you realize he's threatening violence on me online? And, you know, that tweet got taken down. I've only done it once, but I'm glad I did, because I think you've got to say that, saying I'm going to punch you in the face is not an acceptable thing. And obviously something that's much, much worse than that. That was that exact one. But so look, I think it's very difficult. And when the police don't take something forward, if that's what's happened, that's hugely disappointing and very unfair, really. But they have a high bar of evidence too, and when it's in the UK, they have to go to the Crown Prosecution Service and show what and it may be at that point that things fall down, because they may feel they don't have a possibility of getting a conviction, and there isn't. It's not like with us. There's obviously a public interest offence of doing things. The police sort of get slightly more to choose what they investigate. Obviously, you can say that they should investigate certain things, but it's not as though we can sort of say this absolutely has to be investigated. It's I'm not sure it's a fair system. It's the one with. Sorry, that's not a great answer.
No, I think it is a good, and I really love that you said, actually, sometimes it's about giving your phone to someone else for a while. And I also think there's something in, stroke what you want more of. If sometimes they're looking for the response, they're looking for the attention, and you just don't respond. It doesn't make the attack go away, but it might prevent the next one.
You generally is your friend, but I do think at the same time, if somebody is committing a criminal offence online, making a threat that is incitement to violence or whatever, then you actually sort of need to be aware of it, because you might need to screen grab it and show it to the police.
That's true.
So yes, but generally, if it's the more low level nasty stuff, I like a lot of people, quite cathartic in a weird way, just there they've gone. So look, I realize that's not possible in all instances, and also I just want to say as well that you're not. It's really important to know that you're not alone. So one thing that I felt when your phone is like exploding with horrific stuff, if one, that everyone actually is shouting it in your face, even though they're not actually physically doing that. But the other part of it is that it feels like you're sort of standing there naked and the whole world can see. But one, no one else is looking. So it's not like is looking. But, there's a real, I can remember that pain in my chest when it's happened to me. So I do really, really understand. I never want to minimize anyone, because I think it's such a horrible thing to happen. But I think as well, you sort of have to remember that this has happened to a huge number of other people who will, who would want to support you and would want to be saying this is completely unacceptable. You're just not aware of those people. And it is worth remembering you do have support, and obviously, hopefully there are friends and family to help you in the real world. But also there's the sort of normal person who's not doing that. And they would be disgusted that so many people are. But those people, the problem is these people are loud online, aren't they?
They are loud. They are very loud. Peter from Ghana says, what is the best way to deal with getting information from a victim who's feeling reluctant about speaking to a journalist?
It's a brilliant question, and I don't think I've got all the answers there, but I think reassurance as much as you can give, obviously it's got to be true. You got to, but I think if someone doesn't want to talk to you, on these types of stories, you get a huge dropout rate. So somebody who talks to you goes silent, you never hear from them again, talks to you, says, actually, I can't do this. And I think one of the challenges, so I eventually came up with a way that, so because you might get accounts that corroborate each other, I think the final thing you're allowed to say is when somebody says they're dropping out, is you say, that's absolutely fine. I want to make you aware of one thing, because I think you owe it to the other people who've talked to you, if they are definitely doing it, that you owe it to them to say this, which is, if it's true, obviously, that your accounts are corroborating other women's accounts. It can still, of course, be legally helpful that you have other accounts, even if they're ones you're not running. But I think, look, if somebody's made up their mind, and one of the challenges is that you're asking people to jump at the same time. They talk about this in Megan, the Me Too. She said, sorry, it was worth reading. One of the challenges, you've got to get everyone to jump at the exact same moment. And, somebody might be getting married, or they might be having a baby, it's life events, their parents might be dying.
Yeah.
Things that could be going on in their lives. that mean it is not the right moment for them. And getting as many as possible to go at the same moment is very, very difficult. On top of that, you've got a publication date and, you know, maybe TV schedules to think about. So there's just a huge amount that makes that very, very difficult to do.
Yeah. And you're literally asking someone to blow up their life, not just jump at the same time, but blow up their lives at the same time. So it's you know, if they're reluctant, maybe sometimes you need to be willing to walk away.
I think that's right. I think you have to accept that you can't put pressure on somebody in this situation. It's not the morally right thing to do. And you give them their options, but ultimately it's an option and it's their choice.
Yeah.
And I totally understand why people are reluctant, because as you say, you know, if you're not named, so the one thing is, okay, so if you're named, your name is now there, it's Googleable, you know, it comes up, but you've owned your story, right? So if anyone wants to say she's a liar, well, actually, they're publicly, you know, if they're saying it's slandering you, publicly libeling you, because they're accusing you of lying.
Yeah.
Not named, it's a bit harder in that regard, because you could be reading everything that's being said about you online, but you can't reply to any of it. You can't say, you're calling me a liar. So I actually think the two things have quite different challenges. But in terms of, I mean, why are people reluctant to do it? Because neither scenario feels great. There are limitations to both, and worse than limitations, real risks. And, you know, if you meet someone for the first time and they go away and Google you and they find out, oh, you were the accuser of so-and-so, that's a big albatross. I'm sorry, that's quite a weird expression, isn't it? But it's a lot to carry emotionally.
Yeah.
So, I think that's a very British phrase, but
no, it works. It
weighs you down. And a lot of baggage to carry, and also, you know, maybe loads of people would say to you, well, congratulations, I think that was such a brave thing to do. You know, I think it's amazing. So it can come with positive, you know, but at the same time, you know, if you go on a date and and the person comes away and says that, and possibly they're also not the right man for you if that's, or woman for you if that's what they say, but you know, if they will have judgments around that may be difficult for you to deal with, for example, you know, so it is a lot for a person. So I get why people don't do it, frankly, and I say that as a journalist who, you know, obviously relies on people being willing to do it.
Yeah, but there's a very, 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 very brave people who do it. Patrick McConnell says, do you have any advice? Sorry, carry on.
I've always thought we should see it as a form of whistleblowing.
Yeah.
I mean, if people are telling their true accounts, it's a form of whistleblowing, and we don't see it in those terms, but we should.
Yeah, that's a headline takeaway right there. Patrick McConnell says, do you have any advice for men interviewing women about stories of abuse?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, obviously, the same things I'd say to a female journalist. I mean, sensitivity is all. I do think it's more challenging personally. And I was trying to think if I would feel the same interviewing a male victim, because I've actually never done that. I've interviewed male victims of physical assault, people who've had family members who've been killed, that kind of thing. I've never interviewed a male victim of sexual assault. And I was trying to think if I would find that more difficult. And I think I wouldn't, but I'm not 100% sure. I think, and I'm not saying this is fair, but I have often found there's a sort of common affinity as a woman, I guess, that, you know, when they're telling you their story, and obviously it's not you know, you can't be, so you can't be overly emotional. My job is not to be a robot. You know, you're supposed to just say, oh, I'm so sorry that happened to you. You know, it can't be like that, because you are horrified. You know, when you hear these things, I say I listened to a take back and I said, oh my God, I'm so sorry. I mean, it's just human instinct. And you know, being a normal person. But I do think it can be more difficult. But I don't want to tell anyone not to do. You know, I guess, yeah, sensitivity and just remembering that. I always think this on everything. I mean, this is sort of wasted of your life. Never treat anyone as though they're a means to an end. I mean, it's true in any story. So it's very Kantian ethics there, but just don't use somebody as don't ever use somebody just as a means to an end, because you've got to remember they're a person with feeling, family, and all those things. That they're a fully formed individual, and I think in journalism generally, there is a trend to use people, or a habit of using people as a means to an end. And I think it's one always to try to avoid. Yes, that person might get you that story, but ultimately, they've got to come away feeling it was the right thing to do to talk to you, particularly when it's about sexual assault and sexual violence.
There was something on my list of questions that we didn't get to, and this re-triggers, and something you mentioned right at the beginning that we just never came back to, but it's so crucial to this conversation, is diversity. And Taraji was talking about this for almost a decade, more than a decade, before a white lady said something, and then suddenly everyone was talking about it. I wonder, is part of the answer for Patrick to consider taking a female reporter with him to do that interview, because perhaps a female reporter will be able to phrase things in ways that he hadn't thought of, or ask questions that he hadn't thought of, or allow that person to feel comfortable enough to share intimate details that they might not be comfortable sharing with him.
Yeah, I mean, maybe it's an interesting one. I used to do a lot of interviews that would talk about racial issues, and I mean, obviously I present as white, and I would often wonder, should I actually be the person doing this interview? There'll be things I miss, and obviously I tried to be really mindful of what the person was saying, and all those things. And I actually thought that, because there weren't many of us interviewers in my previous job, and I made sure that we were interviewing a diverse. It was really important to me, and I would actually check, regularly, that we were interviewing enough business leaders who weren't white, and all those things. I think it's incredibly important, diversity generally, but specifically making sure that. But and I don't think, and again, I can only speak for the UK here, but we're not doing enough. When you look at the percentage of journalists who are from different ethnic backgrounds, it's not where it should be, and the specific groups that are particularly under represented, and we need to work really hard to change that, and all those things. I don't really ever want to say, though, that there couldn't be a man who gets all this right and understands it. I'm not quite that, because otherwise, fundamentally, I shouldn't ever interview someone who's non-white, and that seems hard to me. So just to accept that. But I think we should be incredibly aware of issues that are specific. So you do find perpetrators who particularly prey on one ethnicity of women, treat women differently. So this is something to be hyper aware of. There was a case in the UK, again, it was public, but a famous man who was preying specifically on Black women. And I think that's something to be hyper aware of, because that can, it's sort of like the complex, there are other issues as well as the sexual violence there that are hugely relevant, and what it says about what it says about society, but also I think you've got to be hyper aware of those things, because sometimes there are things that you might miss as somebody who's white, or a man, asking these questions of a woman. So I think it's worth that. And I think there are really good examples of good reporting. One of the things I've always thought highly respected about She Said, it's both in the book and the film, they admit they made a terrible error in that, because they did something I think is appalling. And I remember watching it on screen. I've forgotten it had happened because I had read the book by then. But I saw it on screen. I just could not believe it. When the journalists, who are brilliant journalists, one of them told the husband of a woman who'd never told him what had happened to the woman, basically she was a victim. And I remember watching it and just thinking, oh my God, that's like the most horrific thing I've ever seen. But better to be honest about making mistakes, and we can all learn from other people's mistakes. And so I think there are really good examples of sexual violence reporting that we can all learn. also, if people are good enough to admit their mistakes on these things, it's worth always keeping them in our minds too. And so I don't think there's anyone who can't do this, is what I'd say. Sorry, that was a very long-winded
No,
answer.
that was a really, I'm glad that we took time to speak to that directly. We have run out of time. I do think Anonymous asked, are we underreporting sexual violence against men because they're not seen as interesting stories? Please, Anonymous, can I say just directly, no, those are interesting and valuable stories, and please bring them forward. I think there's been reluctance around bringing those stories forward.
I think it's sometimes harder for male victims. Sometimes harder. It's very hard for any victims to come forward.
Absolutely. Yeah. Because of the societal expectation around what's going to happen. Rosamund, thank you so much for your time. It's been so wonderful. There are so many more questions we didn't get to. Maybe we should have made this a 2-hour session, but the hour we had, wow, thank you. And we will be back on Tuesday next week, not Wednesday. So please do join us. And thank you all. Goodbye. Bye, Rosamund. Thank you.